To take their seat, we're going to get started in a moment or two. Hey. Yeah, we're about to get started. So. Hey. You putting in a bid? Well, yeah, I don't think it. Thanks. 1 o'clock we start. Yeah. Thanks. Are we live online? Excellent. Well, if I can ask everybody to take their seats, we're about to get started. We have a bunch of people also participating virtually as part of this applicants conference. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Phoenix, and welcome to those of you who are joining us virtually. I'm Jeremy Grant. I lead the National Program Office, charged with implementing the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or NSTIC. Today is an event that is not a formal part of the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group meeting, but we decided, given how the timing worked out with the release of this second federal funding opportunity for NSTIC pilots, to take advantage of the fact that we'd have so many of our stakeholders and potential applicants out here in the same place. And so rather than force you all to come to Washington, although we will be having a second applicants conference later in the month, we'd actually bring this show to you. So I also wanted to express my appreciation to the steering group secretariat, Trusted Federal Systems, who, because they are ending up paying for the room and all of these facilities, including the virtual webcasting infrastructure for the day, we were able to leverage all of this for this event, and so it makes it easy to bring one of these shows on the road. Joining me today to talk a bit about the recently released federal funding opportunity is Mike Garcia, who I think a lot of you know as the Deputy Director of the National Program Office, and Debbie Chen, who is from the NIST Grants Office, and will be covering a lot of the different aspects of particularly on the technical side of what you need to do to actually apply for a grant or what that involves to be the recipient. So briefly today, we'll be talking, kicking off, first of all, with an overview on NSTIC, which I think will be something that most of you heard before, but because this is a new federal funding opportunity, we need to take a few minutes just to talk about what the strategy is and what we're looking to accomplish with it. From there, I'll give an overview of the pilots program and its scope. We will then have Mike give a more detailed overview of the FFO that was released last week. Debbie will go over some of the administrative requirements, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. Much like last year, we'll be accepting questions the old-fashioned way from people in the room. Anybody who is participating virtually who would like to submit a question can do so over Twitter using the hashtag NSTIC. We did this last year, and it worked pretty well. And I'll be sitting up here with my iPad looking to see what comes in, and if we get overrun, we've got some folks who will actually help write down questions so we can manage the flow coming in. And we expect to wrap up by noon or so. So let me just get started. A high-level overview of NSTIC. Again, I know most of you are quite familiar with the strategy, but seeing a few new faces in the room, we want to talk about it just a little bit today in terms of what it is, why we're here, and how we got here. So the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace was first envisioned back in 2009 after President Obama's administration conducted a comprehensive cyberspace policy review, which recommended 10 near-term action items, the 10th of which was looking at the intersection of identity management and cybersecurity, but looking to come up with a strategy for the country that looked not just at the security side of identity, but would also look to leverage privacy-enhancing technologies for the betterment of the country and make sure that in any strategy, privacy and civil liberties interests were accounted for. The result of that was a document, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, which was released with the President's signature in April 2011, that it calls for an identity ecosystem, essentially a marketplace where in an online environment, all individuals and organizations can better trust each other because they're following agreed-upon standards to obtain and authenticate their digital identities. And there's 4 guiding principles that run throughout the NSTIC, which is that the identity solutions we create together must be privacy-enhancing and voluntary, they must be secure and resilient, they must be interoperable, and they must be cost-effective and easy to use. At a high level, NSTIC's really looking to address 3 key issues. The first is that usernames and passwords are fundamentally broken, both from a security standpoint, where even recommendations for strong passwords are still vulnerable to a variety of different attacks, many of which are easily executed by folks who are looking to execute them. And from a convenience perspective, most of us are trying to manage 25 or 30 different passwords. The complexities of it are becoming well, more and more complex each year, and I think if we polled people in the room, or certainly people in the marketplace, most people only have one or two passwords that they're just using again and again, which kind of defeats the purpose of having so many different passwords to begin with. With this, we've seen rising costs of identity theft. Javelin studies show that there were 11.6 million U.S. victims of identity theft last year at a cost to the country of $37 billion. And also that there was a 67% increase in 2011 in the number of Americans that were actually impacted by data breaches. Passwords have been a common vector of attack in most, if not all, of the high-profile breaches that we've seen in the last couple of years. I don't think it's a secret to folks in this room that they're a problem. Just to back that up, there's a great study that the U.S. Secret Service does in partnership with Verizon each year and several other law enforcement agencies around the world looking at vectors of attack and data breaches. In 2011, 5 of the top 6 vectors of attack and breaches were tied to passwords. The second issue we're trying to get at is that I think coming up on almost 20 years now since the old Dog on the Internet cartoon was published, the cartoon has evolved several times. I think a lot of you have seen the blog version where the dog says to his friend the dog. I had my own blog for a while and decided to just go back to pointless, incessant barking. And then the Facebook version where the dog says to his friend the dog. On Facebook, 273 people know I'm a dog, and the rest can only see my limited profile. The dog cartoon has evolved, but the basic issue of dogs on the Internet has actually stayed the same. Now, we always make a point, particularly when addressing diverse crowds like this, where we have a lot of members of the privacy and civil liberties community, folks who are interested in operating under either anonymously or under a pseudonym online. The government has got no problem with dogs on the Internet. Anonymity and pseudonymity have been, I think, hallmarks of the Internet in its first few phases and have really helped, I think all of us would agree, to help encourage the growth of the Internet. Conversely, there's a lot of times when you'd like to engage in some interesting transactions online that you can't because there's not an easy way for you to actually prove that you're not a dog and that you really are who you say you are. And one of the things that we're looking to do, both within the government and the private sector, is give people the option, if they so choose, to bind proof of their identity to a strong credential that they could then use to engage in more transactions online. The third leg of the NSTIC stool is privacy, which I think is an understatement to say remains a challenge as the online world continues to evolve each year. All of us are asked quite often to provide a lot more information to engage in a transaction than is actually necessary for that particular transaction. And then that data then tends to be aggregated into different honeypots, and the information, of course, is bought and sold and traded, sometimes for good purposes, but sometimes it also creates concerns. We use the example of the driver's license and the movie ticket to point out that when I go to the movies and want to see a movie which is rated R, I'm asked to show my driver's license. Actually, that never happens anymore. But there was a time when it did. And when it did, it actually was irrelevant what state I lived in, what my address was, how tall I was. In fact, it was irrelevant what my birthday was. All they needed to know was that I was 17 years old. Likewise, online, we're asked to provide a lot of information rather than only those specific attributes about ourselves that are actually necessary to complete the transaction. One thing that we're trying to do with NSTIC as we build this identity ecosystem is give individuals the ability to have better control over what specific pieces of information, what attributes about themselves are revealed in different transactions, and give people more control over that. And just to talk a little bit about how complex things are getting online as the internet continues to explode every year with new offerings, and there's new pieces of data being collected. This is a chart from last May's World Economic Forum report on the personal data ecosystem. There's no way any of you can read any of that because the print's too small, but the point that you should come away from is each of these trees represents different types of data, whether it's healthcare data, records of what we're buying online, records in government databases, financial information, academic information. All of these things are different data points that are out there, and the amount of data that is out there in each of us continues to explode year after year. One of the great concerns that actually led to the creation of the NSTIC is that if all of this data starts to get, how should we say it, if the flows get out of hand, if individuals start to think that they don't actually have control over their information anymore, does that erode trust online? And how can we push things in the other direction, actually empowering people to have control over their information and use that as a way to increase trust online and improve confidence in online transactions. So trusted identities are something that can provide a foundation. We can enhance security, helping fight cybercrime and identity theft, and increasing consumer confidence. We can improve privacy, offering individuals more control over when and how their data is revealed and allowing them to share less information in certain types of transactions. And we think the economic benefits will be quite substantial, enabling new types of transactions online, improving customer experiences at websites, and overall looking for ways to increase confidence in going online for different transactions. So our vision, and I always point out that this date of January 1st, 2016 is arbitrary, but sitting here in 2013, it's a good one to look at, is that within a few years we see a broader identity ecosystem where all individuals can choose, and choose is a very important point. This is not mandatory, it is optional, but you can choose from among multiple types of identity providers and digital credentials for transactions that are more convenient, more secure, and privacy enhancing every place that you go online. Now when people ask us, well, how do you know this stuff actually matters? Well, one great example that we often point to is what the government did, particularly the Defense Department, over the last 10 years when they migrated from usernames and passwords to the Common Access Card, which is a hard and smart card with several PKI certificates. A very interesting thing happened several years ago when an order went out across the Defense Department that you had to use these cards and the certificates on them to log into DoD systems and networks, which said the intrusions fell 46% almost overnight, as all of these stolen and spoofed usernames and passwords that folks were using to try and get into these systems basically became useless. That's a pretty big number. It also shows that there's, even as big as that number is, there is no silver bullet for cybersecurity. And in fact, I know there's folks here from Defense in the room or on the phone. They have plenty of other problems when it comes to network security. But as we're looking to try and focus in on the most commonly used vectors of attacks, the ones that are most easily exploited, this is great proof that passwords aren't particularly good and people use them to get into systems, backing up what we saw before with the Verizon study and the Secret Service study. So, of course, one of the questions that logically flows time and time again when you see this number is, man, that's a compelling number. Why is it that the rest of the marketplace hasn't actually embraced this kind of technology? Well, the answer is there's barriers. There's a number of barriers that exist that the marketplace has not yet overcome, and I would say the industry that produces a lot of these still hasn't overcome either. I think the first is that higher assurance credentials tend to come with high costs and higher burdens. They've also been quite impractical for many organizations. You haven't really seen a lot of multi-application credentials, but rather they've been for single-use applications. As an example of that, so my brokerage gives me a one-time password generator, which I appreciate as a second factor of security when I log into my relatively meager account, but regardless, they think it's valuable enough that they want to secure it with a second factor. But that actually comes at some great cost to them, and I can't use that any place else I go. And I'd like to be able to, or I'd like to have some other sort of token that I can actually use as I go to different sites online. So, why is that? Well, we don't have standards for interoperability, or at least the ones we have could be better. We, have also big policy issues like liability, privacy, that there's a lot of outstanding questions on that frankly need to be answered if we're going to truly have this sort of interoperable ecosystem where different entities are willing to trust each other and trust each other's trusted credentials. So these are things that the market on its own has made some progress on but is yet to overcome. Focusing on these barriers is really where we've tried to actually focus a lot of efforts in the NSTIC program office, in part because so much of what we're doing is trying to work in partnership with you in the private sector to drive the creation of the ecosystem that is actually envisioned in the NSTIC. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. Focusing in on these barriers continues to remain the key focus of the pilot efforts that we're funding. What NSTIC calls for at the end of the day is for the private sector to lead the way. This is not a government-run identity program. We very much believe, and in fact it was very clear when the White House was putting this document together a few years ago, that if the government tried to actually specify a particular technology or even set of solutions, we would fail. There's simply too much innovation going on in the private sector, too many entrepreneurs. I know a lot of you are in this room who are coming up with new great ideas for how to actually manage identity and authentication online. Technology is constantly evolving. The last thing we want to do from the government side is to specify a particular technology that would become the basis of things. And frankly, we think the private sector will be in a much better position to ensure that whatever ecosystem emerges improves customer experiences, improves the user experience at the end of the day, because that's going to be a very important factor in terms of actual adoption and success of the strategy. So what the government has been looking to do is provide support. So obviously we spent a lot of time trying to help develop a private sector-led steering group. The third plenary of that will be kicking off in about 2 hours. Since we're NIST, we can help facilitate the development of interoperable standards. As part of the government, we could also have a broader charge, which is to help provide clarity on some of the big policy and legal issues that are out there that need to be resolved in order to let this ecosystem thrive. We can fund pilots like we're talking about today to help drive progress in the ecosystem. And finally, the government can do work to be an early adopter of these kinds of technologies to help stimulate demand. So the National Program Office that, well, 2 of us are from, and Debbie's from NIST Grants, is charged with leading day-to-day coordination across the government and the private sector. We spend a lot of time with the steering group, and we're also the entity that is overseeing this federal funding opportunity, and we'll work closely with the awarded pilots, much as we are doing right now with last year's round. We were funded with $16.5 million for fiscal year 2012. All of those dollars were allocated, and one thing to keep in mind today as your companies are or other organizations are considering bidding is we actually don't have clarity on our FY13 funding yet. That's not unique to NSTIC, by the way. If you're following the budget debate out of Washington, it is an interesting time. However, we are here because we believe there will be some funding. The real question is going to be how much and what is the size of the pool, and I'll talk about that a little more later. So, let me just close with, key implementation steps. The first was convene the private sector. We've done that. We're all here for the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group meeting, or at least I'm assuming most of you, if you're out here, will be sticking around for what's to come. Continued support for pilots. Last year we awarded 5 pilots totaling $9.2 million, and we will continue to put a tremendous amount of effort and resources into making sure we have vibrant pilots this year and for years to come, and working to make sure the government can be an early adopter to stimulate demand. So that is the somewhat quick NSTIC 101. Sorry if I rushed through it. So let me shift a little bit now to the pilot program and talk a little bit about the purpose and scope. So at a high level, let me just, before I start, take a step back. I know many of you were involved in some of the bids last year, some successful, some not. I think the FFO, if you've had a chance to read it, it was published last Thursday, you'll find there's a lot of similarities in terms of high-level objectives relative to last year's federal funding opportunity, but there's a lot of tweaks and changes as well. Last year was the first year of the program. There were a number of lessons learned that emerged as we went through the process, working with many different bidders. And so it is a very different solicitation in many ways, particularly when you start to look at the evaluation criteria that Mike will talk about in a bit. But the overall purpose really remains the same, which is to fund pilots that can advance the NSTIC vision, objectives, and guiding principles, and specifically look to demonstrate innovative frameworks that can help provide a foundation for the identity ecosystem envisioned in the NSTIC and tackle some of the barriers that to date have impeded the ecosystem from being realized. This is something I also talked about last year in the Bidders Conference, which is at the end of the day what we really want to do with these pilots more than anything else is make something happen that otherwise would not. So I'm going to say that again. We want to fund things that will make something happen that otherwise would not. And by that we really mean we want to test or demonstrate new solutions, new models, new frameworks that don't exist in the marketplace today, or if they do exist, they have not been widely adopted, and fund deployments of them that would show that we can actually deploy these sorts of solutions in a way that aligns with the NSTIC. So, at a high level, applications should really look to actually demonstrate how is grant money going to make a difference? How is it going to make something happen that otherwise would not? And how is the marketplace going to at least potentially be moved, in part because this funding is available? We want to focus on barriers, as I mentioned before. The marketplace has struggled in part because the market forces alone haven't yet solved all the challenges that we actually have within the ecosystem. We have a dearth of identity solutions and trust frameworks that cross multiple sectors. Some great work's been done so far in individual sectors, but we really want to start to actually see trust frameworks that can cross multiple sectors. And until we do, it's a little difficult to accrue some of the benefits of broad identity solutions the way we're looking to see within the ecosystem. We don't have a great set of common standards yet for security, privacy, or data use. We want to help address that. There's dissonance that's arising from rapidly changing technology and applications and its impact on individual privacy and civil liberties, particularly in terms of how end users actually perceive some of these new technologies and in often cases don't trust them. There's a lack of clarity on liability and other complex economic issues. For example, who's liable if something goes wrong in if something goes wrong in one of these transactions? How, if at all, should a transaction be monetized? There's a lot of ideas that are out there. We don't actually have agreement yet on a true way to go forward. We don't have a great set of commonly accepted technical standards that actually ensures interoperability among different types of authentication solutions. Some good work's being done there. I know the Standards Committee just had a great 2-hour meeting before this, but we need to do better. And there's been challenges with usability of strong authentication technologies that in many cases have caused individuals, particularly consumers, to reject using them. So we're very interested in funding pilots that will focus on these barriers and propose creative solutions that could potentially overcome them. We want to see pilots that can demonstrate the feasibility of solutions that are consistent with the NSTIC vision and guiding principles and can provide a foundation on which the ecosystem can be constructed. Much like last year, we've crafted this as a challenge-based approach. Last year we laid out, I think, 12 different challenges. Here we've narrowed it down to 10 objectives that are examples of challenges for applicants to try to solve. I want to be clear, applicants are not limited to addressing these 10 challenges. There certainly are a lot of other challenges in the ecosystem that are worthy of attention. It's really just a starting point for applicants to consider. So running through them, the first is the feasibility of the ecosystem itself. There are some who say NSTIC's a great document. I think my favorite quote when it was launched is, "It's like puppy dogs and rainbows. You can't really be opposed to it." But that alone doesn't actually demonstrate that the concept's feasible. Well, we'd love to fund projects that can actually interoperably and securely link multiple sectors through trust frameworks, including multiple identity providers and multiple relying parties. A second challenge is focusing on relying parties themselves, who I think it's safe to say when you look at the different types of people or organizations, rather, who have been quite interested in the implementation of the strategy, we need to do better with relying parties, particular major ones that we all do business with online, and how could we actually support pilots that would expand the acceptance and use of trust frameworks and third-party credential providers with major relying parties. Third is focusing on strong authentication technologies themselves. How can we create and demonstrate solutions that can help both public and private sector entities alike more easily jumpstart adoption of strong authentication technologies in lieu of passwords? One example we put out there is the concept of secure and reliable identity exchange hubs that could be a bit of an easy button for RPs who actually want to start adopting new solutions but are overwhelmed either technically or with all the logistics of where to get started. Fourth, focuses on consumer demand. How could we create better user-centric solutions to address some of the limitations and barriers of past efforts in this space that have inhibited consumer demand for strong authentication technologies, and actually look for ways to incentivize consumers to want to obtain a strong credential. Fifth is really looking at some of the policy issues. How can we create and demonstrate frameworks of policy, rules of behavior, and agreements among different stakeholders in the identity ecosystem that can be applied across multiple trust frameworks and provides certainty on liability or other economic issues, or a strong set of privacy and civil liberties protections that can be applied across the ecosystem. This needs to be done. I would direct people when it comes to privacy to focus in on the NSTIC itself and some of the things that it talks about in terms of things that are objectives to improve privacy protection mechanisms. Sixth is looking at the topic of privacy-enhancing technologies, which I mentioned, the government's interest in this predates the issuance of the NSTIC itself, going back to the President's cyberspace review. Some of this actually comes out of a workshop we had about 13 months ago up at NIST on the concept of privacy-enhancing encryption, where the general take was, this stuff's really promising from both a privacy and a security standpoint, but a lot of the attendees at the end of the day were wondering whether there's a business model for it. And looking for, whether the technology, while it's sound from a cryptographic standpoint, whether it'll meet, what people consider are commonly accepted performance standards. So in our first round of pilots, we actually have multiple pilots that focus at least partly on this barrier, and it remains a high topic of interest within the organization. Seventh is focusing on interoperability, particularly how pilots could demonstrate interoperability among different types of identity solutions in a single ecosystem. Number 8 is focusing on the topic of attributes, which is certainly a hot topic within the steering group and many other stakeholders. How could we actually come up with frameworks, methodologies, or solutions that can better enable the exchange of specific attributes associated with identities, while also at the same time minimizing the sharing of non-essential information in a transaction. The 9th focuses on usability. How can pilots demonstrate better, more innovative presentations of interfaces to enhance what we would consider meaningful end-user choice and usability of solutions. And 10th is looking to partnerships with the public sector, other things that the public sector can actually do, whether it be federal, state, local, tribal, a role that they can play in helping individuals actually prove their identity to private sector credential providers in the sector. We have one of our pilots is focusing on that right now, and we'd frankly love to see more. So, funding, as I mentioned, is a little tricky. I mean, we are, for those who aren't following things closely in Washington, there are two things that make it a very interesting situation. The first is that by the end of the month, agencies may actually be sequestered if there's not an agreement on the budget. And then following that, the government is only funded through 6 months, basically through the end of March. And so there is a continuing resolution, which essentially is fancy speak for saying we're level funded right now at fiscal year 2012 levels through the end of March, but then Congress needs to actually reach agreement on how we will be funded for the rest of the year. So in the appropriations process so far, the White House asked for $24.5 million. The House, the Senate allocated $24 million, and the House did not allocate any money, and we're basically looking to see how that works out. Last year it was very similar. We ended up with $16.5 million, and I could stand up here today and tell you I know where I think it's going, but I don't. What we do have a pretty good comfort level with is that there will be something, and based on that something, a lot of it will actually determine what the size of the pilot pool is. If we are fully funded or close to it, we think there might be up to $12 million available in fiscal year 2013, but a lot of it is going to depend on the final budget appropriation. And obviously the number of awards will be contingent on available funding, much as it was last year. Last year, I can tell you, we had a lot of great proposals. We had 186 abbreviated proposals. We selected 27 finalists, and we only had money to fund 5. If we had had full funding last year, we would have funded more. There were a lot of good proposals that were unfortunately left on the table. So something to keep in mind, given the funding uncertainty, and given that I've done B&P in a couple organizations in the private sector, I understand you might need to contemplate what the costs are going to be relative to the opportunity. What I can say is this. Mike and Debbie will outline a little bit about our two-step proposal process, where a 4-page abbreviated proposal will be initially due from interested bidders, and then the down select will happen. The way things are looking right now, assuming some sort of resolution on the budget by April 1st for the rest of 2013, organizations that are the finalists will not be notified until after that date, which means that the real investment you're looking at now is essentially putting the team together around a 4-page effort, not a full-blown proposal at this time. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity in terms of effort relative to opportunity, and then what is hopefully some more clarity on the budget situation by the time your organization, if you're selected as a finalist, would have to do a full bid. Much like last year, we expect new awards to range from approximately $1.25 million to $2 million per year, each with project periods, performance periods of up to 2 years. Much as last year, we will fund only the initial funding for the first year, and award of the second year, if there is one as part of the pilot, will be contingent on that pilot awardee meeting certain key milestones, demonstrating progress, whatnot. Just a note on the funding ranges with regard to what we've listed at $1.25 to $2 million. Applicants are free to request smaller or larger amounts. The range is really what we forecast awards will actually be in the range of. And let me talk about that a little bit more, because I think this was a little confusing to some people last year. In fact, we had one bidder, after the awards were made, said, well, we asked for $2 million because we thought that was the number you wanted to see. And my response was, we didn't want to see any number. And beyond that, I think our interest from the National Program Office is to fund as many good proposals as we can with whatever dollar pool that we have. So any organization that has an ability to deliver something meaningful for less should not feel the need to actually request a very big number. There are many different creative ways that we certainly saw last year that proposers had to get a lot of bang for the buck, and that's not a bad thing going forward. So don't feel compelled to ask for more if you can do something meaningful for less. Also, 2 years, again, is the maximum period of performance, but if you can demonstrate a meaningful outcome in a shorter period, and 2 years would be overkill from your perspective, please do so. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Mike Garcia, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the details of the FFO. Thanks. Oh, and by the way, if I can ask people to hold all questions to the end, we will have plenty of time for Q&A. And if you are participating virtually, just remember you can tweet your questions. That's how we will be accepting questions virtually at the hashtag NSTIC. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good morning. I'm going to be talking specifically about the FFO, and that will include things like eligibility, what you need to submit and when, and what we'll be looking at in terms of evaluation. There are many, many words in my portion of this presentation, and I want to save as much time as possible for questions. So if you think I'm flying through these slides given the number of words on any given slide, please know that for the most part they are actually copied pasted exactly from the FFO, because we don't want to be giving different information in the presentation than we actually have in the FFO. So if you miss any particular word, you know where to find it. So the first piece is, can you be an applicant? Who can be? This is a pretty wide pool of applicants. Institutions of higher education, hospitals, nonprofit organizations, commercial organizations, so for-profit organizations are perfectly fine, of course. State, local, Indian, tribal, and territorial governments are acceptable as long as these entities are located within the United States. So with that caveat, who is not eligible? Individuals, federal government entities, entities located outside of the U.S., but an important fourth bullet there is that such entities can participate but simply can't receive NSTIC funding through the grant. So if you have something interesting you want to do with a federal agency, that is perfectly acceptable. The federal agency just can't receive any funds under your proposal. If you are an organization that is based outside of the United States, but that is an international organization, I should say, but has locations in the United States, is located in the U.S., feel free to ask questions about the exact specifics of that situation, but in general, such organizations are also eligible. Simple statement, cost sharing is not required. So last year, those that were involved in the FFO know that you submitted the abbreviated proposals via email or hard copy, and the full proposals through grants.gov. Everything is through grants.gov this year, abbreviated proposals and full proposals. So if you have any questions as to where to submit something, the answer is grants.gov. I assure you that's the answer. So when? Abbreviated proposals, as Jeremy mentioned, there are 4-page abbreviated proposals. From those, we'll down select to a smaller pool of applicants and request that they submit full proposals. The abbreviated proposals, those 4 pages, are due March 5th, which is not too long, but also only 4 pages. So you've got yourself, about a page a week, which is, if you can produce that, then you're doing just fine. Finalist notification we anticipate on the 9th of April. So that is when you will know whether you've been down selected and whether we are requesting a full proposal. You then have just over a month, if you are part of that down select, to submit the full proposal. We anticipate making selections in August and awards starting no sooner than September 1st of 2013. As opposed to 12. It definitely also will not start prior to September 1st of 2012. For the abbreviated proposals, the project narrative is the formal term, and you will also need to submit an SF-424, which is just the general application for federal assistance stating who you are, and that is signed by someone who is authorized to say that you want money. The FFO number is in item 12. These are the specifics. Look on the FFO for this and make sure that you fill this out properly when you submit it on grants.gov. This is, of course, a silly way to not find yourself winning a grant. So the abbreviated project proposal, a word process document of not more than 4 pages, can be single-spaced, and has sufficient information to address the evaluation criteria, which are the things that are copied and pasted from the FFO that I will be discussing in a few minutes. So this should focus very, very succinctly on what you want to accomplish relative to the evaluation criteria, what you will get done and how you will get it done based on those evaluation criteria. When it comes time for the full application, you'll be doing the same thing, only with much less brevity. Again, you'll have an SF 424, application for federal assistance, also budget information for non-construction programs, which this is a non-construction program. And this will have all your anticipated expenses for each year of the project being no more than 2 years, and will include potential cost increases, cost of living adjustments, your really truly best estimate at a budget. SF 424B, assurances, CD 511, certification regarding lobbying, and the SF LLL on lobbying activities. The technical application, probably what you're more interested in hearing about from me, also word process document, no more than 25 pages. It must be responsive to the program description and the evaluation criteria. The evaluation criteria is absolutely what your application will be assessed against, so it is for sure what you should be speaking to. It should contain an executive summary, the project approach, statement of work and implementation plan, qualifications of those proposing, those involved in the project, and an explanation of the resource availability. Separately from that, thus not subject to the 25-page limit, letters from project partners, statements of commitment, and a budget narrative, which I'll discuss a little more later. So the statement of work and the implementation plan is most likely the heart of the description for many of the applications. This should have the proposed tasks, milestones, measurable milestones and events, measurable performance objectives, and have work breakdown structure and many other things to show that you have in fact developed a project. This is, there's also an important aspect here to identifying those tasks that involve human subjects and including some explanation and categorization of those tasks. If you don't know what that means, it probably would be wise to figure that out. It is an important, if there are human subjects involved, it is an important aspect of all grants of the federal government to know how they are involved and be very careful about how you are working with human subjects. So please be aware that that is an aspect of the statement of work and implementation plan. Letters of commitment to participate from partners and from third parties. This is about what their commitment is to participate, what they intend to do. This can include subawardees, it can include contractors, any other collaborators, anyone that will play a part in the pilots, whether they're receiving funding or not. Can submit a letter. As part of the application. So, onto the evaluation criteria. These are different from where they were in the previous year. We hope there's some more clarity because there were some that were important, but definitely difficult concepts, and this is the NSTIC is no easy thing to solve. So, of course, there are going to be some complexities. So I will walk through these as well. The first is adherence to the NSTIC guiding principles. So the strategy document itself has 4 guiding principles, as Jeremy mentioned, and the adherence of these pilots to each of those 4 guiding principles is extremely important and is something that will consist of 30 out of 100 points of the evaluation. This is privacy enhancing and voluntary, secure and resilient, interoperable, cost-effective, easy use, and integration of all 4 parts. So we've added a 5th there that is not a guiding principle, that is the integration of the guiding principles. So this is an important aspect of any pilot that you have not demonstrated privacy over here on this aspect, and you have demonstrated interoperability over here on this aspect, but have not actually integrated those parts. That is equally important as any of the 4 guiding principles individually. 30 points for quality of implementation plan, 30 points for the overall contribution to the identity ecosystem, and then 10 points for resource availability. So, digging into each of these a little more finely. The privacy enhancing and voluntary guiding principle, it's important that any solution in the identity ecosystem mitigate privacy and civil liberties risks and that are brought about by additional tracking, personal data aggregation, et cetera. So the bottom line, as is stated in the NSTIC, as is the mission behind our program office and the identity ecosystem as a whole, is that the assessment of the privacy enhancing and voluntary evaluation criteria is grounded in the FIPS. Those are Appendix A in the NSTIC. If you're looking for them, they are also widely available on the internet. So what reviewers will be looking for is specific details on how privacy and civil liberties will be protected, and that protection will be fully implemented within the pilot scope. In particular, we'll be looking for a demonstrated understanding of privacy and civil liberties risks raised by the proposal and how those risks will be mitigated. This includes how the proposal addresses collection, use, disclosure, transmission of personal information, when and in what manner that information is used, why and for how long information is kept, and security measures for that retention of information, how it has minimized collection of information. How in the pilot are you minimizing information to what is absolutely necessary? How is data aggregation and linkage across transactions minimized to that is necessary? How the proposal provides appropriate mechanisms to allow individuals to access, correct, and delete personal information. How is it that individuals remain in control of their own information? How do you establish accuracy standards for personal information and identity assurance, authentication, or authorization solutions? How do you protect that information, transfer it at the individual's request, and securely destroy it when terminating business operations with an individual? How is the information collected, used, disclosed, transmitted, retained, and provides mechanisms for compliance, audit, and verification, and finally provides effective redress for mechanisms for individuals or on behalf of those individuals. Second part of that is identifying how the FIPS from above, the ones that I just read over the previous two slides, will be implemented technically and through policy, and which will be implemented through technical and which will be implemented through policy means, and supporting performance metrics for any said implementation. Performance metrics, measurable performance metrics. What role, if any, trust frameworks will play in common enforcement of these policies that makes them applicable to all participants of the project, including IDPs and RPs and the other role players within any given pilot. Second guiding principle, secure and resilient. This is about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of identity solutions, non-repudiation of transactions. How do you demonstrate that any credentials that are issued or used are secure, that they can be reissued, and that individuals in general will be protected in ways perhaps that are better than they are today? So what reviewers specifically will be looking for is how solutions are secure and resilient. That one's a little bit more straightforward. So in what way will trust frameworks be applied such that even if participants within the trust framework aren't using the same technology, we can have some idea that they are, at least on a risk basis, applying similar security or appropriate security based on their role. How does the solutions embrace security mechanisms that provide material security advances over the current dominant password-based regime? How are these solutions known to be reliable? And how are these solutions integrated amongst all aspects of the project? So interoperability, this is seems like a really obvious one, but it's not always. Within interoperability, this is about how not just that a solution that is developed is interoperable with the other parties with which it's intended to be interoperable, but that other solutions can be made interoperable with it as well, so that this becomes an ecosystem that is convenient and easy for individuals, as opposed to, say, one entity interoperating with another entity, which has a very, very small reduction in ease of use for consumers, assuming that they interact with, say, 50 entities. One working with another one doesn't help a whole lot. So that is really the true essence of interoperability. It's much larger than on kind of a one-off, because we made it work sort of interoperability. Reviewers will be looking for specific details on how the proposed solutions are interoperable, including how trust frameworks ensure that all participants adhere to common standards, policies, rules, and ensure proper and consistent treatment of personal data, how solutions leverage existing standards or demonstrate the need for new standards and an ability to materially enhance the development and adoption of these new standards. How solutions can be used across multiple sectors. Jeremy discussed that as a point of emphasis, and it most certainly is. Reviewers will be looking for how multiple sectors can be involved, and interoperability can be created between them. And how individual credentials are simply and securely portable between RPs with appropriate notifications to individuals. So how can credential reuse occur amongst RPs? That also gets very much to the ease of use guiding principle, which is next. Solutions, sure, they can be technically complex in the background, and that's okay, but they need to be understandable, they need to be easy to use, they need to be intuitive, and they need to be enabled by technology that requires minimal user training. There are many ways to do this, including thoughtful integration of usability principles and user-centered design. And many technology components that are currently in widespread use can be leveraged to act as or contain a credential, as I'm sure many of you in this room have thought about. Reviewers specifically will be looking again at how trust frameworks can lower costs for all identity ecosystem stakeholders and erase barriers to usability. How solutions do not present significant usability challenges for individuals. How solutions propose innovative applications of technology that enhance usability relative to the current market solutions. So we all know what it's like to live online today. How will solutions make that easier? How cost per user are not prohibitive and can grow the identity ecosystem in accordance with the four guiding principles. How solutions lower barriers for user acceptance, and how service level agreements provide easy to understand opt-in choices for the consumer to use a service. Finally, the integration of these four guiding principles should demonstrate that they are, in fact, as obvious as it sounds, all integrated and implemented in an integrated manner together. The next section, also worth 30 points, is the quality of the implementation plan. So this should involve schedules, quantified objectives, metrics, methods of measuring those metrics, milestones, risks, and plans for stakeholder outreach and integration with other efforts. This is about how the plan actually comes together as a project. So reviewers will be looking for things like milestones, detail around tasks as to how they will be executed, understanding of risks and what the responses to those risks will be, alignment with performance metrics, and that those performance metrics relate to project objectives and the NSTIC guiding principles, and the roles of all of the participants. Contribution to the identity ecosystem, also 30 points. Reviewers will be looking for details on how many end users this could affect. So how big could this be, and in what sort of timeline? What is the inclusion of a range of roles in the project? Is this purely an IDP thing? Is this an IDP thing to an RP thing? Are there IDPs working with attribute providers, working with relying parties that actually builds towards a complete ecosystem? The inclusion of a range of sectors, again, perhaps you've heard this before in today's presentation, including multiple sectors. The ability of the proposed project to develop new or strengthen existing digital identity services. So what actually does this add? Very succinctly, what does it add? Also, the reliance on new or existing trust frameworks to accomplish project objectives. So what is the role of trust frameworks? Is it a new one that has to be created? Will it be created within the project, or is it something that already exists that is being implemented? The ability of the proposed project to contribute to the development of the identity ecosystem framework. So this, in a couple hours, when we start the meeting for the identity ecosystem, to develop the identity ecosystem framework in the steering group, how does the pilot contribute to that? How does the pilot contribute to those overarching policies that are required under the identity ecosystem framework? What does the scaling look like post-project? How does this ramp up? How does it get commercialized towards the end? And that feeds right into the quality and comprehensiveness and likelihood of success of the pilot into production following the grant period. And finally, how the applicant intends to interact and engage with identity ecosystem stakeholders to ensure transparency and visibility with the identity ecosystem. So what can the rest of the ecosystem learn through this pilot about how to develop identity solutions and how to move the ball forward in the identity ecosystem. Resource availability. So reviewers are going to be looking for the commitment of quality resources. They'll be looking for the appropriateness of those resources towards the scope. And they'll be looking at the plan's ability to obtain or leverage additional or external resources to engage in post-project commercialization and move the project forward into production and routine use. So what happens then is we have these evaluation criteria, and then when projects have been deemed fundable and have met that criteria, there are then selection factors that are made for the final determination. These include the availability of federal funds, which, as you can imagine, will be potentially a large part of the selection factor process. Whether the project duplicates other projects being funded by NIST, or whether this is something new, or by other federal agencies. The diversity among projects, so the whole set of pilot projects will be an important final selection factor. The diversity of technical approaches, and the diversity in gaps in the emerging identity ecosystem relative to the potential for funding new projects. So here's how the process works. You get this 4-page in your SF 424 submitted, and it goes through an administrative review. Did you meet those very simple eligibility requirements? Is this complete? Did you turn in what you were supposed to? Did you turn in a 50-page instead of a 4-page proposal, at which point the remaining 46 pages will be lopped off and only the first 4 will be read? Responsiveness to the scope, does this even address what we were asking? So making it through administrative review is a relatively short hurdle, followed by the technical review, the evaluation criteria, and at least 3 independent reviews. So these are conducted by federal employees, and they will be looking at, independently looking at the evaluation criteria and the proposal to determine how they meet and how they are scored based on the 30-30-30-10 point distribution that I described just a few minutes ago. They're then ranked, and the selection is made using that rank and the selection factors. If you are above the line, so to speak, from that review process, you are then asked to submit a full proposal. I've already discussed what has to be submitted with that. So then once we have received those applications through grants.gov, to go through, again, administrative review. Did you meet the administrative requirements? If you did so, it goes into technical review, again, based on the exact same evaluation criteria. Again, at least 3 independent reviews. At that point, an evaluation panel will be convened. They'll analyze the applications and technical reviews and rank those applications. They'll also be looking at the independent reviews, as part of that. Then the final selection is made using those ranks and the selection factors. At that point, if you are among the few left standing, then it goes into the award process, and all of a sudden administrative requirements become extremely important. And Debbie will talk about those. Thank you.
Hi. I'm considerably shorter than Mike or Jeremy, so. Hi, I'm Debbie Chen, and I'm from the NIST Grants Office. This next section is really an overview of the key administrative requirements that were outlined in the federal funding opportunity. Before we begin, I'd like to note, as Mike and Jeremy both mentioned, that all the items the majority of the items that we'll be discussing in this section will apply only to the full applications and not the abbreviated proposals. So this morning, we'll be discussing how to prepare the budgets in your submissions. In particular, we'll be discussing what we are requiring or requesting in the budget narrative, how indirect costs can be charged to the award. We'll give some examples of allowable costs and some examples of unallowable costs. We'll discuss the distinction between vendor contracts and subaward agreements, and we'll also discuss how cost share should be reflected in your application. After that, we'll discuss expectations once an award is issued, should you be selected for funding, how recipients will be paid, what can be expected in terms of intellectual property, what are the reporting requirements under these awards, and what are the audit requirements. And finally, we'll conclude with an overview of human subjects research. The SF 424 budget pages group costs into different cost categories such as personnel, travel, fringe, supplies, equipment. But on the 424A, it's reported as a lump sum figure. So for reviewers and NIST to have a better understanding of how resources are going to be allocated on your project, we ask for more specific details in this budget justification. And as a reminder, the budget justification does not count against the 25-page count. So for personnel, we're interested in knowing the name of the individual, the job title, the level of effort on the award, the salary rate, the total direct charges, the role of the individual on the project, and the work to be performed. It's perfectly acceptable if you have individuals who have not been hired or have yet to be determined to put a TBD with approximate salaries, worked that you're expecting. Fringe benefits should be separated out separately from salaries and wages, and items included in the fringe benefit rate should not be also charged under another cost category. So for instance, if you have parking as part of your fringe benefit, it should not show up again as a direct cost under the other cost category. The federal government defines equipment as an item that has an acquisition cost of over $5,000 and a useful shelf life of over 1 year. Now, your own organization could have, by policy, set lower thresholds than that, but NIST will only look at items at that $5,000 threshold as equipment. Anything below $5,000 should be included in your supplies line item. It's important to note that when you are charging for equipment, that costs should be allocated according to usage. So if you purchase a $50,000 piece of equipment and you're only using it 50% of the time on honor award, that you only charge $25,000. Travel is also an allowable expense under the grant. We ask in your budgets to give us an idea, estimates on who will be traveling, to where you'll be traveling, how long, why it's necessary for the project. These can be estimates based on your prior experience. It's important to remember that recipients under the pilot project will be required to report twice yearly to the steering group committees, like the one we're having here. So if you plan to charge it against the award, to budget for it. For supplies, we're looking for a breakdown of the cost for each supply and the necessity of the cost for the project. We'll be discussing the difference between vendor agreements and subawards in a later slide, but generally, we're looking to see a list of each vendor contract, a description of each service or product to be provided, and the cost and necessity for the performance of the award. For other costs that do not readily fit into any of these other categories, please include it in the other line item, with similar justifications and breakdowns as in the earlier categories. Indirect costs can be charged against the award. If your organization has a federally negotiated rate with a cognizant agency, we will accept that rate, provided that it is up to date and that we receive a copy of it prior to award. If your organization does not have a negotiated rate, you can still charge indirect costs on the project. In the budget submission, just give your best guess for what you think the indirect rate will ultimately be, and you will be required to negotiate a rate with the Department of Commerce after award. The link at the bottom of the slide provides general information on the negotiation and preparation of indirect costs. So what are allowable costs that can be charged against a grant award? Well, in order for a cost to be allowable, it must meet all 5 of these criteria. It must be reasonable, which means, is this something that a prudent person in a similar circumstance would pay? Is it allocable? Can this cost be easily attributed to this particular project? Is it allowable under grant terms, regulations, cost principles, and statute? Is it necessary for the performance of the award? And is it consistently charged regardless of the source of funds? So if your institution regularly charges a cost as indirect, it should charge it as indirect using the federal funds as well. The general guiding principle is you should treat federal funds as if it were your own. One of the conditions for allowability is that it must be allowed under the cost principles. The cost principles are regulations that provide guidance on costs that are typically allowable and typically unallowable, and whether they're allowable as an indirect cost or a direct cost. One of the most helpful sections of the cost principles is this list called the selected items of cost, and it'll go into different cost categories like travel, alcohol, entertainment costs, advertising, legal fees. So if you're interested and have questions about whether or not a cost can be charged, you might want to research it first under the cost principles. And the cost principle that applies depends on the type of organization. So if you're a for-profit organization, 48 CFR Part 31 is what you would refer to. Or if you're an educational institution, you would follow 2 CFR Part 220. Generally, costs that are directly related to the technical work will be allowed. This includes salaries, wages for the staff that are working on the project, any equipment or supplies, and materials. The travel to the steering group meetings, which are required under this federal funding opportunity, will also be allowed. And any audits that are required may be charged as a direct or indirect cost depending on the circumstance. Examples of costs that are not allowed on the awards include profit or fees for the recipient or any subawards, application and writing fees, contingency fees, any cost that is explicitly disallowed by the cost principles, and any costs that are not required for the technical work of the grant. When preparing your budgets, it's also important to make the distinction between a vendor and a subaward agreement. A vendor procurement agreement is an acquisition for a purchase, lease, or barter of a service or product, whereas subawards are financial assistance awards from the recipient to a subrecipient. This chart shows the difference between a subrecipient and a vendor. A subrecipient performs a substantive part of the programmatic work. They're usually involved in the design and conduct of the project and are usually reimbursed for their work based on time versus on a fixed price. Vendors provide goods and services in a competitive market, and they will provide the same service to many different organizations. The distinction is important because the requirements will be different. For subrecipients, all of the terms and conditions that apply to the recipients will flow down to the subrecipients. So for instance, if no fee or profit is allowed for the recipient, no fee or profit will be allowed for the subrecipients. This will apply to any audit requirements, any reporting requirements as well. For the vendors, profit can be charged because it's just considered a normal part of doing business. Another reason it's important to distinguish between a subrecipient and vendor is because NIST will be requesting budgets and budget justifications from subrecipients as well. So everything that we've discussed earlier, we will be requesting from them. As Mike mentioned earlier, cost sharing is not required for this federal funding opportunity. However, if your organization plans to provide other sources of funds, please make it very clear in your proposal what is being funded out of the federal dollars. What is the scope of work? What is the work that you are funding through other sources? And what will be the work to be completed after the project is officially over? We are asking for budget pages only for the federal portion. You can give us a lump sum figure for any cost share that you might be voluntarily contributing, but we're not looking for that level of detail, only for the federal portion. And as a reminder, all scopes of work and budgets are subject to negotiation and amendment prior to award. So if your organization is issued an award, what can you expect? All the awards under this program will be issued under the cooperative agreement mechanism, which means there'll be substantial federal involvement from the awarding agency, which means that you'll be seeing Jeremy and Kat and the rest of the FPO and interacting with them fairly regularly. In addition, all NSTIC grant recipients are required to follow the administrative requirements, the DOC Financial Assistance Standard Terms and Conditions, the Financial Assistance Award Form, and all the special award conditions that are attached to the actual award. All recipients are required to enroll in ASAP, the Automated Standard Application for Payment System, in order to draw down federal funds. And funds can be either drawn down in advance or as a reimbursement. For new recipients, you'll be asked to supply a copy of your audited financial statements and potentially a certification that your accounting system meets the minimum standards for handling federal funds. This requirement can be substituted with other alternatives. In terms of reporting, recipients under this program will be required to submit quarterly technical and financial reports. In addition, for intellectual property, recipients will be required to submit inventions and patents through iEdison.gov. And as discussed earlier, recipients will be required to report twice yearly to the steering group. If you are a nonprofit, state, local government, or an educational institution, for audits, you will follow OMB Circular A133. For commercial entities, you will follow the audit requirements that are listed in your award terms. And you should budget for those audits as needed in your budgets. Bayh-Dole applies to all intellectual property that is developed under federal awards. It permits recipients to retain title to the invention provided that it is disclosed and the government is granted a royalty-free, non-exclusive license for its own use. Human subjects research is an area that we are asking our applicants to consider as they prepare their proposals. There are two key definitions that are contained in the CFR. The regulation defines human subjects as a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual or obtains identifiable private information. Research is defined as a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. This federal funding opportunity does not require proposals to engage in research activities. But we are asking you to consider some questions. Is the data provided from a commercial source? Is the data to be used pre-existing? Was the data collected for this specific project or for other purposes? Is the data anonymous? Does the data come from the individuals who may need special protection? And those special classes are children, pregnant women, and prisoners. Does the data include public behavior? Examples of human subjects in research include collecting of biometric data for testing purposes, surveys or focus group discussions for requirement solicitations, or even bringing in members of user communities to test software. In your proposals, we're asking you, to the extent possible, you identify and separate tasks as either research or non-research. And if it is research, whether the research involves human subjects. If you need assistance in any of these determinations, you can always contact our Human Subjects Advisor, Linda Beth Schilling, whose name and contact information is at the back of the FFO. Or alternatively, you can look at the link at the bottom of the slide, which is the OHRP decision tree. It's just asks you a set of yes or no questions, and based on your responses, will lead you to a determination for your task. While we understand that this area of human subjects research is new for many of the applicants under this program, so it's not scored as part of the criteria. While it's strongly suggested to be included, it will not necessarily be a required element, but it certainly will be required for it to be resolved prior to award. Prior to award, recipients may be requested to submit justifications for tasks they feel that are not research but may have human subjects data or humans data involved. and NIST reserves the right to make independent determinations on whether an applicant's proposal involves research with human subjects. Additional information may be required as part of the application review process. If an award is issued, no work involving human subjects research can be performed without the written prior approval of the grants office. Retroactive approvals are not permitted. Organizations that are involved in non-exempt human subjects research will be required to sign a federal-wide assurance with OHRP, the Office of Human Research Protections, and have their protocols reviewed by an institutional review board or an IRB. Recipients with non-exempt human subjects research will have to submit a copy of the protocol to the IRB, to NIST as well, along with the approval letters, and establish the federal-wide assurance. For work that involves pre-existing anonymous data, an IRB review will not necessarily be required. However, NIST will seek detailed written information and make an independent determination. So this concludes the administrative portion of the presentation, and I will turn it back over to Jeremy for the questions. Thank you.
Thanks. So, is this handheld on? We're going to pass this back and forth for the portion of this. We have had one question come up on Twitter so far. We will be accepting questions through hashtag NSTIC. Very appropriately, the first question was submitted by a dog on the internet named Maui, whose handle is Die Squirrel Die. And the question is, will the slides be made available to the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group? And somebody else had actually posted where it may be. I just want to be clear that the pilot activity and the bidders conference we're having today is an activity separate from the steering group. The slides will be posted on our website at nstic.gov, or you can also get to there by going nist.gov/nstic, but that requires more keystrokes. And if they're not up already, they should be shortly. They are publicly available, so if the steering group secretariat decides to post them there as well, they're welcome to. But these are two separate efforts, and the place to go to get additional information about this opportunity remains our website and the grants.gov website that has been set up. So with that, by the way, first of all, thanks to Mike and to Debbie for getting us this far. It's almost 11:15. We have till noon, and we will take questions both from those in the room as well as those virtually who are on Twitter. Again, you can ask questions through the hashtag NSTIC. I have one. Do you? There you go.
I rarely get asked that question. Let me ask a little bit of transparency question, which might be technical and might not. And I apologize if it metastasizes into two questions. Mike read off from the FFO a list of all the things we want successful grants to do. There's a lot of them. So you go through a process, you evaluate, the grants are awarded, we go out into the world. To what extent will the information that comes off of that, in terms of audits, in terms of assessments, in terms of, post hoc, you go back and say, okay, was this as privacy enhancing and inoperable and all that as we thought it was? To what extent is that data stream going to be visible to the community so that hoi polloi can look at this and say, okay, yeah, look, gee, that thing was privacy enhancing and it did use or find new standards and all that other stuff. I mean, it's a great set of criteria, but on the outside, the question for the broader community is going to be not just how do we learn whatever goes into the 10-page final report, but how can we assess the process of those grant projects. Maybe this is a technical question, but I just don't know how much that material that is created in your supervisory stream is made visible to the outside world for that purpose.
So, it's a great question. Part of the requirement of the grants, both for the ones we awarded this past year as well as for this new round, is that they report at a minimum twice a year to this Identity Ecosystem Steering Group that will be convening formally at 1 o'clock. I'll be talking about this a little more in my opening remarks at 1. We have not had formal presentations yet, as most of the pilot awardees have needed a few months for what are some complicated projects to sort of get their legs under them. But the expectation is if you are applying for this and you win, not only will you be opening up as much as possible to share with the group, but you'll be an active participant in it. And I've frankly been really pleased with the first round that all 5 of the awardees have been actively participating. There is not, just to clarify, we had some questions around the time the last grants were awarded. Does the steering group actually get to have a formal role in managing the pilots? And the answer is no, for a number of reasons, the biggest one being the conflicts of interest could be an absolute nightmare to manage, and so it's cleaner to run them as two separate but complementary efforts. Beyond that, Debbie, is there anything that you want to add in terms of what would be available under the grants rules?
So generally, if we want to discuss, like in terms of what's available under FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, generally, when you submit an application into NIST, if it's an unfunded application, we typically do not release that information. But if you become funded, then it's essentially the U.S. taxpayers who are paying for this. So they are going to have they have a right to request to see, for instance, items that are in your application, progress reports, and things like that. Now, there are kind of exclusions and things that can be redacted. They don't necessarily get your proprietary information. And should a FOIA request come in, the originator of the document, which would be the company or the organization, would have first pass at redacting it. But generally, yes, that information should be available, if you're funded, to the public.
Okay, that is helpful, and I guess that's something for people who are writing grants to keep in mind, that other people might be reading it someday. Let me follow up then with this. Given that the current flight of projects in round one is getting started but hasn't really gotten under robust reporting yet, for people who are looking at the second program, the first thing they're going to want to look at is, what can I find out about the ones that got funded last time? So what's your best advice for where to go to find out whatever it is that you folks have been able to make available about information about the details and projects and progress of the first successful awards?
Sure. Another great question. We've put a little bit of information on our website. Frankly, not a lot. I'd like to get more up. It's that is something in progress. I believe most, if not all, of the awardees have put out some sort of a press release and done some sort of an announcement. I know at least one, Internet 2, has hosted several webinars in terms of what they're doing, and some of those presentations are not particularly hard to find if you would say do a search for Internet 2 and NSTIC. There are some who have been let me get into a bit of a thread that we got into in an email discussion a few weeks ago when it was suggested by a member of the steering group. We should get them out there as soon as possible and let the prana feeding begin. The idea being that this is a room full of interested people and a steering group full of very interested people who the effect might be piranha-like. We have at this point largely deferred to the pilot awardees to decide exactly when is the right time to open up all of the details about what they're doing, in part because in some cases what the pilot awardees are doing is quite complicated, not just from a technical perspective, but also bringing in some very major brand name relying parties whose names may not have shown up in the press release and they may not be willing to until things actually go live. And my comment back to that person and others who were asking about can we let piranhas feeding begin was, I'm more concerned right now about letting the pilots have a little room to operate and be successful and share as they're ready to. I don't think it'll be more than another few months before most of them are. But the worst thing would be, and I think I used the example of Ford, who's I just say is not one of the pilot relying parties, but if you had a big company like Ford who suddenly had 500 people on Twitter decrying their role in some pilot and skewing something they'd be doing, that would be a great way to ensure that they don't participate. And so we've tried to be really striking the balance between how much information can we share and how can we rely on the expertise of the steering group to actually help answer some tough questions on some of the pilots without prematurely forcing something. But there is information that's out there, and I think all the pilot awardees are also in this room and may be willing to share with some of what they've been up to as well. So thanks, Jamie. Let me turn to Twitter, where we have a question, which is, what role does access control play, and specifically attribute-based dynamic access control, a consumer of identities and not a NSTIC pilot? I'm not sure I fully understand the question in terms of saying not an NSTIC pilot, but as a technology, I think attribute-based dynamic access control is certainly one of many technologies that can have an important role to play in the identity ecosystem. But to be clear, there's I don't think there's anything in the pilots that we are actually calling out that is expressing a preference for one type of technology to be part of the pilots versus another. I think if there's an interest in any particular technology, it is the sort of the challenge is upon anybody who would propose use of it or an approach or technique or whatever it is to relate it back to the evaluation criteria and the objectives of the pilot. So it's not to say it's important or not important. It plays a definite role in it, but it doesn't tie particularly into any specific criteria of the pilot. Did I miss anything?
No, I might simply say you tell us. That's the role of a proposal, is to explain why this is part of the NSTIC identity ecosystem, whatever this may be, and justify that as being something new and exciting that is worthy of receiving federal funding.
The next question on Twitter is, will you distribute a list of attendees who are in Phoenix and on the webcast? This would tremendously help form partnerships. The answer there is I'd like to, in terms of helping form partnerships, but there was actually no registration required for this. I actually don't know who's in this room, and you're not required to attend. We will be holding a follow-up event at NIST on Valentine's Day in Gaithersburg, which will essentially be a repeat of this for those who could not make it in person. And there, actually, I'll have to check to see if we can post the attendee list, because you have to register at NIST in order to get on campus, because it's a federal facility. But in this case, we opted to keep things wide open. But I would suggest, among other things, using Twitter and ability or other tools that are out there to try and connect with others who might be interested in partnering. I know certainly here we'll also be having, not we, but I believe the steering group will be hosting an optional networking lunch for those who want to talk to others who may be interested in playing a role. So I'm sorry we cannot produce a list. I also just want to raise one other point, which is this is a bit of an unusual event for a conference for a federal solicitation, in that usually when these things happen, you get potential bidders in the room, the government folks are at the front of the room, and then when it's over, we all run away because we can't talk about it. We're all here with you the next few days, actually collaborating on a lot of other fronts. When the clock strikes at noon or whenever this comes to an end, that's the last time anybody associated with the National Program Office can actually talk about the solicitation. We can't be having one-on-one conversations. So please don't put anybody in the tough position of asking them to talk about it. There will be another window again on Valentine's Day at NIST. Again, virtual participation will be enabled there too, which will be our second applicants conference. But we cannot talk about it at this anymore. So we'll, ask you what you think about the Phoenix Suns or the upcoming Who concert or things like that if you ask us. Are there any more questions in the room? We have one in the back corner.
Hi, I'm Charles Harvey with Factor 3 Technology. Is there, you mentioned one thing for one of the requirements is existing successes in the past in doing different projects. Is it best for a startup like ourselves to lead a project in that case or follow on to another project? Would we be penalized for leading a project is my question.
I would just say you won't be penalized for that. If there's a proven record of success, that is certainly suggestive of future success, but simply because you're a startup, in no way will you be penalized for that. The merits of, if you look at the point breakdown of the scoring, and reason that out, the merits of a good project are aligned with many more potential points in the scoring of an application, I would say.
The one thing I would add to that as well is if you look at some of the awardees of the first round, it includes a couple firms that I think would count as either small businesses or in the startup phase or somewhere thereabouts, which essentially demonstrated they were able to, even though small, put together compelling teams with a lot of members that demonstrated their credibility. So to focus on what Mike said. The most important thing is, can you actually demonstrate that this is a team that can execute and make something happen that otherwise would not? Are there any other questions? We had a lot more last year. I know this is the second year, so we're a little less fresh and new. I'm looking on Twitter. We have one in the back.
Hello. My name is Miroslav Rihak. I'm from Czech Republic, Europe. I'm owner of technology company, which 5 years ago started our own research on this topic. We invented and developed some innovative identity ecosystem product. We invested more than $2 million into it. And now we have something which is fulfilling all the criteria of NSTIC. So we believe at the time that we are 3 to 5 years ahead of the rest of the industry, but we are from Europe, so we cannot obtain the funding here. So my question is, first, if we can participate through any partner or partner organization here in the US, and second is how to find a partner. Thank you.
So this was a question that came up last year, I believe, and the question was, are foreign-owned, and I don't know if you're a U.S.-located company, eligible to receive funding under the NSTIC grants? So if you're foreign-owned but U.S.-located company, then you are eligible.
But no, I don't think the U.S.
You are not located, then unfortunately, I don't think that you would be eligible.
Could they participate with a partner?
Well, generally, I think generally the rules for eligibility, I think that might have to be something discussed further if you want what role you'll have, but you certainly could not be a prime recipient.
Well, I understand we cannot be prime recipients here, but the question
Sure.
is if how to manage it with any partner here.
So in this forum, I don't want to give advice on any specific case, right? Because we wouldn't be able to go through all the details and do so properly. But the general rule is that if you're foreign-owned and not U.S. located, you cannot receive funds under the grant. It does not say that you cannot be a partner. It says that you can't receive funds under the grant. But again, in any given specific case, please would contact Barbara Cuthill, whose contact information is in the grant, and make sure that is the case.
Okay, thank you. And second question about the finding the partners here.
You're probably in the best place in town, in that you've got a lot of. These are the people who are interested, and you know, most of them we hope will be here for the next couple days. Yeah. So. I don't have a better suggestion than that. And by the way, you know, we've gotten questions from a number of different, you know, folks, you know, companies abroad who want to participate. And to be clear, it's not that we don't welcome the participation, but these are federally appropriated taxpayer dollars, and there are some restrictions in terms of where they can go. And you know, the way this is set up, we can't be taking, you know, dollars from American taxpayers to be funding development of you know, some of the solutions overseas. Not that there's not an international aspect of NSTIC overall. In fact, there's a fantastic international coordination group that's been set up within the steering group, looking for ways to you know, help bridge gaps between efforts, you know, across the world and different identity and authentication efforts, and better tie things together. It's really a limitation on what we're able to do under the law with federal grant dollars. Do we have any other questions? I'm refreshing on Twitter, but the last thing I saw is that Ian Glazer is sitting here. Hi, Ian. All right. In that case, wait.
Just a clarification question. Can you elaborate what located in the U.S. comprises of? Is it incorporation? Is it physical office, telephone number, PO box office?
So it seems like this idea of a foreign-owned or foreign-based company is generating a lot of questions. So my suggestion, because you know this is something that we want to make sure that NIST is comfortable with as a whole, that you submit these questions in writing to Barbara Cuthill, and we will find some way to either post this so that it's